The quilt that is behind me is one of my award-winning quilts, and all of the fabrics were hand dyed by me. Now, I'm not an expert on these things, but I do have some little tips and bits of information that I would like to share with you in case you feel it's something you would like to try. Now, the first thing to say to you is that hand dyeing fabric isn't really difficult, and so if it's something you haven't done before, there are lots of great books out there to help you, and also lots of information online, including this, of course. And the book that I used most often when I was starting out, and I still refer to it, is this book by a lady called Anne Johnston, and she is an expert hand dyer and printer. She does amazing work, and this is like a recipe book, and it's incredibly easy to follow. The formulas are really easy. Look, you can see I've got some of my notes in there, and it's spiral bound, and it's just really useful. So Colour by Accident is really worth looking out for. So once you have read up a little bit, done some research online, and you know a little bit more about dyeing fabric, you're going to need to get some of your materials together so you can actually do it. And so we'll start with fabric. Now, you can buy what's called PFD fabric, and that means prepared for dyeing, and it means that it's kind of ready to go, hasn't got any finishes on it, it's going to accept the dye, and you're going to get good results. And I have tried dyeing with PFD and just with ordinary fabric, ordinary cotton fabric, and I have to tell you that I haven't ever really noticed much difference between the two. But what I do look for is a high quality fabric, so tightly woven with a lot of threads per inch, so something like a cotton poplin type fabric. But I look for a bright white fabric, an optic white fabric that almost has a kind of slight bluiness to it, because that will keep my colours really bright and really strong. Whereas if you start with a creamy white or a yellowy white fabric, it's going to knock your colours back and they're going to be slightly muted. So if muted is what you want, then yes, start with something that is kind of off-white, not true bright white. But if you want clear, bright colours in the way that I've got in the quilt behind me, look for a really good optic white coloured fabric. And then when you take that fabric home, I think it's a really good idea, regardless of whether it's PFD or just some regular fabric, that you do give it a good hot wash. So either a 60 or a 90-degree wash, just to make sure it's really clean and that all of the finishes, if there are anything that's going to stop the dye adhering, has been taken out of that fabric, and it will accept your dye readily. Now, once you start looking into dyes and the types of dyes that are available, you will realise that there are quite a lot. But we're just talking specifically about cotton fabric and dyeing cotton fabric. And so the best dye for that job is Procyon MX dyes, and Procyon MX dyes are cold water dyes. So some dyes require you to have hot water, but cold water dyeing is really much simpler, and they are very concentrated and they come in powder form. And I was just debating whether to take the lid off this to show you, but I'm not going to, because little bits of powder will fall onto my sewing area here, and I don't want my fabric to pick them up. So Procyon MX dyes that you use with cold water, but there are some other things that you need to buy. And so you will need a fixative, and that is what is going to make sure the dye adheres to the fabric. And if you've done a little bit of dabbling in dyeing, you might have used salt in the past to do that. But a much better, much kind of safer product in that sense, that's really going to make sure your dye adheres to your fabric, is soda ash. And that comes in kind of powdery, granular form. So that is your fixative, and that is really important. So another product that is really useful and will help you achieve better results is urea. and it's a nitrogen based product, and it's used in all kinds of things like fertilizer and in cosmetics, and it is a humectant. I'm not going to muck that letter up. And what it does is it kind of makes things wetter. It almost makes the water wetter, and it allows for more dye to be dissolved in a smaller amount of water, and it allows the dye to get into the fabric so that you get really good concentrated colour. So it is really useful. So that is urea. And the final thing that I think is really useful is a product called Synthropol, and it looks like washing up liquid. You can see that, and it is kind of a bit bubbly when you put it into water. And Synthropol is used in the final rinsing and washing of dyed fabrics. And what Synthropol does is it holds the dye molecules that haven't adhered to the fabric, and there will always be some. It holds those dye molecules in suspension in the rinsing water, and so that when the rinsing water is drained away, it takes those dye molecules with it. And if you didn't use it, those dye molecules that haven't adhered to the fabric will go back onto the fabric and kind of sit on it, but they're not going to be anchored. And then when you wash that thing again, those dye molecules are going to come away into the water, and they're going to migrate onto other things in the washing or other areas in your quilt. So Synthropol is a really good product for helping you to ensure that your dyes are nice and fast, and any dye molecules that haven't adhered to the fabric will be washed away. So why did I actually start dyeing fabrics? Well, I lived for many years in Saudi Arabia, and as you can possibly imagine, it was not easy to find lots of quilting fabrics. I couldn't just nip out to the next town and go to the quilt shop because there wasn't one. But fabric was available, so I used to take the dyes into Saudi Arabia with me after a holiday or vacation, and then I could buy fabric and dye it. And that enabled me to make the quilts that I wanted to make. And it was also very fashionable at the time to use kind of blotchy, slightly mottled hand dyes that had some interesting texture to them. I will say that the fashion now is for a little bit more solid dyes, but not really that there's much difference in that. So when I started dyeing, I just had my book, and I had a little bit of painting experience from kind of my childhood and teenage years. And when I was a little kid at school, all the paints that we had at school were powder paints, and I used to do a lot of painting with powder paints. So I got quite good at mixing colours and knowing what I needed to mix to get the colour that I wanted. So for example, if I wanted a brown, then I needed yellow, red and black, or yellow, red and blue, and different degrees. So if I want a really kind of warm reddy brown, I'm going to put more red into that. If I want a more yellowy, greeny brown, then I'm going to put more blue and yellow into it. So I thought back to what I did as a child, and I did find that experience really helpful. So if you don't know what colours you need to put together to mix, it's a really good idea to research that. Of course, you can buy the dyes, the Procyon MX dyes, in lots and lots of different shades, and some are already pre-mixed, but you might want to tweak it and make your own. And you can see that I've absolutely done that on the quilt behind me. I've got very subtle graduations of dyed fabrics that really add movement and depth to the finished piece. So let's say, for sake of argument, that I wanted to do a purple colour, and I wanted quite a strong pinky, reddy purple. I would take the blue that I thought was the best blue, so maybe a cobalt blue rather than a turquoise blue, and I would take something like a magenta, a good strong pinky colour. And what I would do is I would read my book, and I would mix up my my soda ash to the correct proportion, and I would start to mix my dye with a little bit of water. And it's true to say that some dyes will mix better with water than others. So red is particularly hard to mix, and you often find that you get little undissolved dye particles that haven't kind of mixed into the water solution, and then when they get onto the fabric you get this little strong burst of this dye. So do be careful with mixing, and mix them really well. So I would be mixing my blue and my magenta, and it looks really concentrated in this little pot. By the way, I'm just doing this in my kitchen sink, but I cleared everything away, all the kind of cooking utensils. You can absolutely wear a mask. It's not a bad idea at all. And always wear gloves, because you're just going to get so dyed, so coloured. What invariably happens is there's a little hole in one finger and you end up with a blue finger. But anyway, so mix them up, but they look incredibly concentrated in the little cup that you're mixing in. And how can you kind of tell what's that like? So what I used to do, and it worked really well for me, I would get some white kitchen paper and a teaspoon, and I would put some water in the teaspoon and just put 2 or 3 drops of the dye in the water in the teaspoon, and then just trail that across the kitchen paper, and I could see whether it was too blue or too pink and what I needed to do to adjust it. It's very kind of low tech, but it did really work for me. So that's how I went about kind of working out what I needed to mix and the colours that I hoped I was going to get. So unless you very carefully measure out your dyes and you make a written note and you have very kind of strict formula that you are going to adhere to, it's unlikely that you are going to get exactly the same results kind of on every occasion. And things like the heat of the day and the age of the dye and all kinds of other things can change the colour anyway, even if you are using exactly the same formula. So I have to say, I mean, it's not like me, but I was very kind of unprecise with it in that way. I just thought, oh yeah, that's really nice, I'll go for it. But this is what I always did to get a really great depth of colour. If I wanted to dye, for example, red, and at the time I was doing quite a lot of textured dye, and what you would do is you would mix up your dye solutions, then put the wetted fabric in a plastic bag if it was a small amount, in a bucket if it was a large amount, okay, and you would put it in crunched up, so it was all kind of squeezed up, and you would pour the dye solution on it, and you give it a little bit of a stir and a little bit of a prod and everything. And if you didn't kind of stir it very much, the dye solution would penetrate some areas more than others, and that would give you this textured effect. If you didn't want the textured effect, then you really needed to kind of work the dye through the fabric. But let's say I'm going to do this red and I've got a very bright white fabric. I would find that it became pinky and not the strong red that I wanted. And so for most colours, and I'll just explain that later on, I would dye them at least twice or 3 times. And if I was going to dye red and I wanted to have, for example, quite an orangey red, I would dye the fabric first orange, so just orange, and then the second time I dyed it, then I would dye it red. Now you need to rinse the fabric and dry it to see whether that red is what you want, and if it isn't as kind of strong and as dynamic as you desire, then you dye it again. So most often I would under dye it with one of the paler colours that was in the mix. I would dye it once with the proper colour, rinse it really carefully, and then dry it and iron it, and then it might go back into the dye bath, in this case the red again, to get the depth of colour that I wanted. And if I didn't over handle it and didn't over manipulate it in the bucket or the bag, I would still get that textured effect. And that's exactly what you can see behind me. So if it was purple, I might pre-dye it pink, or I might pre-dye it blue. If it was green, I would pre-dye it yellow, and that might be an acid yellow or a golden yellow, depending on what I wanted. If it was brown, I might pre-dye it red, and so on. And that, I think, is something that I just decided that's what I needed to do, and I didn't get that information from anywhere else. I just thought, oh, we'll just keep sticking it back in the dye bath and we'll get what we want. And if it doesn't turn out to be what you want, it's never a wasted piece, because you can always dye again with a darker colour and get some exciting results. So just a little bit of information there to kind of whet your appetite and explain what I did and why I did what I did. I haven't actually dyed any fabrics for quite a while. That's partly because I now live in the UK and I have got fabrics available, and it's also not quite as kind of fashionable as it used to be. But that's not to say that I won't dye again in the future, because there are so many possibilities with dyeing and painting and printing fabric, and I certainly couldn't have achieved the quilt behind me if I hadn't hand dyed my own fabrics. My only word of caution with you is you need to rinse them and rinse them and rinse them. They take up a lot of water and a lot of time in the rinsing, and it's fine if you're making something like a wall hanging that is not going to be washed, but if you're making bed quilts or items that are going to be washed, you really need to rinse them very carefully until the water is running clear, and that is where the Synthropol is your friend. So something fun to try there, not difficult, get some really interesting results, and you can make really individual work with your own hand dyed fabrics.